All right, everybody, we are back for section 13 of Comparative Criminology, which really ties in very nicely with what we talked about back in section 12, because section 13 is all about international law. So what is international law? Well, it's law that two or more different countries have agreed to and abide by, right? And one of the things that international law does is it defines what a state is and isn't. And once again, I'm not talking about states like Tennessee or Oregon. I'm talking about states as in nations. And excuse me. In general, we take for granted that there are this many countries in the world and their borders are this and that, but let's say a certain region of a country breaks off from the main country and forms its own government and its own military. At what point does that become its own country? Like, at what point do we say, oh, it's no longer one country, they have now split and become two? That is a lot more difficult than you would think. So international law comes in, and in the modern day, there is a process by which countries get together and they say, okay, we are choosing to recognize that this country is now separate and distinct, and we're going to start having diplomatic and economic relations with them directly and not going through the country they used to belong to. In the modern day, we can kind of sort of see this process play out or not play out, as the case may be, with Taiwan and China. So China maintains that the island of Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan says they're independent. Some countries have recognized the independence of Taiwan, but some countries officially still only recognize the government of China and believe that China governs the island of Taiwan. So it's kind of a tricky diplomatic situation right now about whether your country will officially recognize Taiwan as its own separate country or not. International law, in many cases, becomes part of national law. This is not quite as straightforward as, our diplomat signed the treaty, thus, great. It can apply directly to individuals, right? So things like war crimes trials are when international law is applied directly to individuals. And then finally, it can guide legislators, right? So, we have this international law talking about reductions in greenhouse gases to combat climate change. Well, legislators in every country need to know about that treaty and those laws and how that international law is guiding the use of greenhouse gases, and then they can use that to guide their own national legislation about, how are we going to do this? Now, international law takes many forms. The most common and kind of the easiest to kind of use as examples are conventions or treaties, right? And these have been going on ever since there have been nations. One of the more famous ones, at least in my mind, as a cybercrime person, is the Berne Convention, which originally started in the late 19th century and is about copyright law. And essentially, it's a large convention or treaty where every country that signs it agrees that if something is copyrighted in any one country, it is therefore under legal copyright in their country as well. So if somebody in America copyrights something, nobody in any of the other countries can violate that copyright without being sued, essentially. But in addition to these conventions and treaties, there's also custom, generally accepted principles, judicial decisions, and these can all kind of form parts of international law. The common law tradition, especially in the early parts of our country, judges would say, according to English law, this, and this happened, and that is customary, and thus we're going to do that. For many years, it was just international custom that governed, what parts of the ocean belong to which country, right? So, how far out do America's territorial waters go? Is it, 5 miles from shore? Is it 20 miles from shore? For a long time, that was just up to custom rather than any specific convention or treaty. All right, so the way treaties usually work is that, 2 or more countries get together, they create this document, and diplomats from all the representative nations sign it. But that's not the end. That doesn't mean that international law now has the force of law in all the countries that agreed to abide by it. It has to be ratified first by that country's own government. So, for instance, if the United States signs a treaty as part of the UN, a treaty against, who knows, digital currency, something. The American UN ambassador will sign it, but then they have to take it back to Congress and say, hey, we signed this treaty, you guys need to pass a law to kind of enforce it. And this process is called ratification, right? So at that point, the US Congress has to write a law that matches what the treaty says, get that passed and signed by the president, and only then does it have the force of law within the United States. Hopefully all the other countries will also ratify it, and then it actually has force in each one of those countries. Unfortunately, there are many instances where countries have said, oh yeah, we'll agree to abide by that treaty, and their diplomat signs it, but then their local government doesn't pass it, votes it down, or just never votes on it at all. So despite the fact that they have signed the treaty, they haven't ratified it, and thus it doesn't have force in that country and can't be enforced. Now, of course, the big elephant in the room when it comes to international law and international treaties and those processes is the United Nations, right? So after World War I, the United States and the UK and all the victors of that conflict tried to put together a group of nations to kind of hope to prevent the next World War, and that was called the League of Nations. And obviously it failed because 20 years later we had World War II. And after World War II, the League of Nations was kind of seen as a failure for many reasons, so they decided to start all over again, and they created the United Nations. And the United Nations, at this point, almost every country in the world belongs to the United Nations. There's a very small handful of countries that still refuse to join. Almost every country is part of the United Nations and works with the United Nations for many different goals and processes, and everything from military to money lending to food aid to disaster relief, all these things. The United Nations does all that. And it's divided into 6 parts. And the first 5 are located at the UN headquarters in New York City. So those 5 are the General Assembly, which is, everybody. There's the Security Council, which, mostly deals with military matters, and we'll talk about specifically here in a moment. There's the Economic and Social Council, there's the Trusteeship Council, and there's the Secretariat. So those 5 different groups are responsible for different things that the UN does or potentially could do. And they're all located in New York. The 6th and newest is the International Court of Justice, which is located in The Hague, in Western Europe, I believe the Netherlands. And that is the newest piece, and we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically later on in the section. But the Security Council, this is the one where, if military decisions are going to be made, if, the most impactful decisions are made by this group. And it kind of works in a way that it's really difficult for this group to get anything done. Because there's 15 members, but 5 permanent members, i.e., which are US, UK, France, China, and Russia. So essentially, the 5 biggest, most powerful countries that were on the winning side of World War II when the United Nations first started. Then there are 10 other members that are elected by the General Assembly, I think every 2 or 4 years. And, sometimes that's Colombia and Belgium and Brazil and Japan and, 10 other members. But those kind of switch in and out every few years. What makes it difficult for this group to get anything done is that if any of the 5 permanent members vote no on something, the answer is no. So 14 of the 15 countries can be like, yes, we need to do this. This is a good idea. If any one of the 5 permanent members doesn't want to do it, it doesn't happen. They have this ultimate veto authority on any decisions that are made by the Security Council. And when you think about those 5 countries, especially the US, China, and Russia, it is really, really, really rare that those 3 countries can ever agree to do anything. They can't even agree on what day of the week it is most of the time, let alone whether they should send in military troops to, some foreign country where a genocide is happening in order to stop the genocide. So the Security Council, it is very, very, very difficult for them to really accomplish much. But at the same time, they have accomplished a lot. Looking at it historically, they've done more than nothing. They've got some really important, high quality, beneficial to humanity things accomplished. Now, human rights. As part of the UN, in that whole post-World War II process, lots of countries got together and they created this international treaty called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this was a very, very important document. This, for the first time, it said, look, humanity has rights. For instance, we have the right to be free from slavery, right? We have the right to life, and we have the right to food, and we have the right to water, and we have the right to, be human beings. And it's a really wonderful document. You highly recommend going out and finding a copy and reading over it and seeing which countries have ratified it and which haven't. But the downside of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that there is absolutely no enforcement mechanism. If somebody violates it, okay, what are we going to do about it, right? So there's no real way to hold countries to the standards as set out within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A few years after that one, Europe got together, and as part of that whole, Europe coming together and agreeing to cooperate more and forming the EU and, European countries really deciding to be closer than they traditionally were pre-World War II, they created the European Convention of Human Rights. And this was very similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but even broader. So for one thing, it very clearly and explicitly said that the death penalty is a violation of human rights and is not allowed in any country that has ratified this treaty. And maybe even more importantly, it has enforcement. There is a court set up, I believe it's in France physically, but if any country that has ratified that treaty is thought to have violated any of the parts of that European Convention on Human Rights, they can be taken to court and forced by the other members of the European Union to, stop doing what they were doing or start doing what they need to be doing or whatever, if that thing violates the European Convention on Human Rights. So this is a really interesting area, human rights, and what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights covers and doesn't cover, and what certain phrases have been interpreted to mean by different countries, and how it's been, whether it's been ratified or not ratified by any given country. It's a fascinating, fascinating subject. And again, I highly recommend you learn more about it. But as a kind of an introductory course, we can't go too much into it. But we will be back for the final section, final part of this section, where we're going to talk about international courts and tribunals. See you in a minute.